The RMS Titanic sunk in the early hours of April 15th in 1912 after colliding with an iceberg in the Atlantic Ocean. Here are the top 10 dark Titanic secrets the survivors don't want you to know. Kicking off list at number 10, first class. While traveling in first class may feel more comfortable when it came to the sinking of the Titanic, first class passengers had a better chance at survival. Just over 200 first class passengers survived out of the 324 souls traveling in first class during that fateful voyage. If you've seen the James Cameron film, you know women and children were first to board these lifeboats, and then it was first class men. By that point, there were a few lifeboats left, which I'll get into later on, that's a whole thing. But second class and third class, their chances at survival were not great. Being stored further and lower away from these lifeboats, it took longer to get there, especially with the rush and the crowds too. It was chaos. There were more than 700 third-class passengers. That number exceeded the other two classes combined. And those rooms were horrible. They were crammed. 4 people would have to share one tiny room, and each of the beds were smaller than twin beds. So when it comes to evacuating quickly, sadly these passengers had the hardest time getting out. Number 9. Locked doors. Ellen Hakarian was aboard the Titanic April 15, 1912, and back in September 1987, Tanky magazine published her survival story. It was titled Going Down with the Titanic in Third Class. Ellen and her husband Pekko decided to leave Finland and start a new life in America. The night of April 14th, after the couple had returned to their cabin and got settled in, they heard a loud scraping sound and the engine started to act up a bit. Pekko left the room to go and see what was going on. The hallway was tilted by time Ellen poked her head out moments later once she heard a ruckus in the hallway. There was then a knock at the door, and one of her friends from Finland came, and they said the ship was sinking, but Pekko was nowhere to be seen at this point. He was still gone. Her friend asked, how did he get out of the passageway in the first place, because all the doors are now locked. I was confused. I didn't know what to do next, and after a few moments I grabbed my purse and life jacket and ran out to the passageway. The door was locked. All the doors were locked. A steward finally came along to guide the crew to the third deck, where they were taken to the Carpathia. They didn't arrive to a safe ship until the sun was up the next morning, and after losing her husband and all of her belongings, Aileen received $125. That's horrible. After that entire night, they're like, here's some money. That would be around $4,000 now, which is not enough to fix anything. Number 8, record time. It's been noted by many survivors that the Titanic was traveling quite fast, faster than anything they've experienced before. Well, that's because the ship's captain, Edward J. Smith, was trying to beat the crossing time of the Titanic's older White Star sibling. Now, there were already concerns about icebergs at this point, but the fact that the captain still went ahead at full speed, regardless of all the oncoming icebergs, well, sure didn't help. Astronomers at Texas State University at San Marcos discovered something cosmic that may have had something to do with the sinking of the Titanic that night. The alignment of the sun, the moon, and us on Earth could have created higher than normal tides in the Atlantic Ocean around January 1912. So by the time the Titanic was whipping through months later, icebergs that used to be stuck in the Labrador Sea could have gotten in the way. It also would have helped to see the iceberg approaching from afar. But number 7, no binoculars. On the night of the collision, binoculars were locked up the entire time. Of course, this could have possibly changed history, so why weren't they used? Where were they? Well, the key to the lockup was being held by Officer David Blair. Only before the Titanic's departure from Southampton, Officer Blair was pulled from the crew. Of course, this may not have made a difference at all, with all things considered, but it's important to note. To think these were stashed in a locker in the crow's nest this entire time is actually pretty haunting. Poor guy was transferred to another ship and forgot to give the key back. The amount of times I've taken a work key home with me, honestly, it's a simple mistake, so this is tragic. Number 6, wrong turn. It's the middle of the night, there aren't any binoculars at disposal, it's high tides, it's hard to see, but did the steersman accidentally point the Titanic towards the iceberg? Well, back in 2010, Louise Patton said this story was passed down from her grandfather, who just happened to be the most senior ship officer that survived that disaster. Apparently what happened was the iceberg was seen, and of course there was little time given the speed of the ship at that point, so command immediately issued to turn hard a starboard. That command was passed down a line like broken telephone. It was screamed past multiple people, so eventually the command was received as, make the ship turn right, rather than push the tiller to the right, which would have made the ship go left. It's confusing, and also at that moment, it's hard to hear. There's no chance this is anyone's fault. Number 5, not enough lifeboats. Before the Titanic set sail, at some point, a decision was made to reduce the number of lifeboats on board. They did this because they didn't want to clutter the deck, and looking back now, it's honestly haunting to think that was once a thought, like that mattered at all. It just ruined the aesthetic, like, okay, sure. The safety of 2,208 passengers aboard, we could use some more boats. The number of lifeboats ended up being reduced to just 20, with an additional 4 that were collapsible. 24 lifeboats. That's it. This meant that should they even have time to launch every single boat, this would only still be enough for half the passengers on board. Only half. And that's if it worked perfectly at that point. Even when the Titanic was going down, not all the lifeboats were able to be launched as everything unfolded quickly. Number 4, staying warm. The Titanic was obviously quite fancy. Its dining selections were fancy, the wines were fancy, it was all fancy, but alcohol was sadly reserved only for first class. The bar had 1,500 bottles of wine and 20,000 bottles of beer. Most of the people who passed away that night, it was because of icy temperatures in the water. I mentioned the alcohol in the cold water because one passenger named Charles Jogan, Charles was the baker on the ship, and when he realized the fate of the ship, it was probably going down, he drank everything he could see. He just chugged as much as he can. Honestly, I'm on board with drinking responsibly and all that, but if this was the case, yeah, of course, go for it. You don't want to be sober when this is happening. Charles was found 2 hours after the ship had completely gone down, somehow still treading water, and also somehow alive, and also extremely drunk. What happened here was the alcohol, the rather large amount of alcohol, slowed his heat loss, so he was able to hold on until help arrived, luckily. Number 3, a helping hand. John Astor was one of the first class passengers on the ship that night. Now, as the ship was sinking, he put his wife on one of the lifeboats, but as he was about to get in himself with her, he saw 2 children standing behind him. Of course, they were petrified. So John Astor, he gave up his spot and let those 2 children take his instead. One of the Titanic survivors named Philip Mock later saw John and his valet huddled together on one of the life rafts trying to keep each other warm, but they both sadly didn't make it. A sad story, of course, but John's wife and the child that she was carrying at the time both survived and made it to safety. Number 2, an alternate trip. Not much was found of the Titanic afterwards. The pressure of the ocean, all those many secrets are truly lost to history. But there was an inspection card found. It belonged to a woman named Marion Meanwell. Now, this may seem like a mundane find at first, but it revealed a grim story for the woman. Once the card was found, it was revealed that Marion was not intended to be on the Titanic that night, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of those passengers. The card shows that originally she was supposed to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic, but due to a coal strike, the Majestic voyage was delayed, and she instead was then assigned to the Titanic. On Marion's card, you can see Majestic crossed out, and the new trip says Titanic. It's grim, it's very heartbreaking. And finally, number 1, ignored flares. Barely 20 miles away from where the Titanic sunk, there was another boat. This one was called the SS Californian. This boat had stopped in order to avoid the ice. The crew on the Titanic had also received warnings about the icebergs. The Titanic had actually received about 6 warnings before the collision. Only the first few were received by the captain. Now, the captain of this other boat slowed down and actually saw the emergency flares being set off on the Titanic ahead, but he ignored them because he thought they were company rockets. And the SOS signals that the Titanic sent out as well weren't received until the next day because the radio operator on that SS Californian had gone to sleep. By the time they heard these calls and arrived the next day, it was of course too late. Those are the top 10 dark Titanic secrets the survivors don't want you to know. If part 2 is something you're interested in, comment down below and I shall return with more facts. I've been your host Taylor McWaters and I'll see you next time on Most Amazing Top 10. Peace.